Prowndar Crucio, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Matthew Sims and I'm head teacher at Chepstow School. We're delighted many of you have logged in today and equally delighted and grateful to be able to share with you 10 prominent and respected educationalists who I hope will provoke and challenge you today. Never more so during this pandemic has education been in the spotlight. Clearly, along with our health system, and ever more so have we seen education quickly adapt, respond and rise to the challenge to deliver high quality educational experiences, albeit remotely. My own thoughts about today's event, titled Education Post-COVID. Will we ever get to a position of post-COVID, or will we have to learn to live alongside this and potentially the viruses? I think it's prudent to take a moment or two to reflect on how well we've adapted and what a fantastic job we always do. I mentioned you'll be challenged today by our speakers. My challenge to you is simple. We've shown we can adapt and flex, develop creative methods for learning during the pandemic and embrace future technology. But why did we wait? How will you continue to unlock the potential of every learner, set the right conditions for staff in our schools to achieve creative, engaged and curious learners for our futures? Sat in front of you every day is potentially the next Tesla, Sagan, Kieran Shaw, Thunberg, Gates and Hawking. It's your job, our job, to inspire learners, stretch and challenge our children and unlock their potential. Jamie Goddard, our assistant head, will introduce speakers and compare this event, and Ben Sillins, our deputy head, will close this event today and offer a summary. Finally, on behalf of the school and I'm sure audience members, thank you in advance to our speakers. Diolch yn fawr. Please enjoy.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who is presenting this afternoon. It's very much appreciated. It's a very exciting lineup. We've got presenters from a variety of backgrounds, institutions and experiences. The brief today was very simple. What will the educational landscape look like post-COVID? That can be short-term, medium and long-term. What should we keep from the past 12 months? What have we learnt and what opportunities are there to change? In essence, how brave can we be? We welcome your comments and thoughts to be put into the chat. There's a Q&A chat. And the presenters will respond after they have finished. We also have a hashtag Chepstow Seminar for you to comment on Twitter. We welcome your thoughts and perceptions. I would very much now like to welcome our first speaker. I had a great privilege to be working with Mick a couple of years ago in schools in South Wales, and I learnt a lot from him. Mick is a very prominent speaker and is associate with Wolverhampton University. Has done lots of work with both English and Welsh government. So I'm delighted to hand over to Mick Waters.
On, and actually they're not there. The teachers know they're not there. In normal times, you know, there are many youngsters present in the classroom, but actually playing truant in their mind. So it'd be worth thinking about how some of the things we know, or what some of the things are that we know, and how we go forward to use that in the future. We know, for example, that many youngsters are under pressure in terms of their well-being. So they will need a rounded learning like never before, learning that makes sense in a world that can't have had much sense about it in the last 12 months. We know that they will need a curriculum that touches their heart. Music, art, literature, and they need challenge and they need enjoyment in good measure, and they need play and time to talk. They'll need rounded learning like they've never experienced it. We know that many youngsters have seen pupil application growing without exams. Now that children know that exams are not going to be there this year, children apparently in year 10 and 11 who would have probably given up and cast their fate to the winds are now applying themselves and given that their teachers are going to be the people with the say over their qualifications and future, there's a different atmosphere in so many sessions that teachers are running. This does question the view that's held by many, including many school leaders, that exams are a big motivator. Those who have done best, the children who've done best, are those who've understood and practiced self-regulation, being active in themselves, in well-being and learning, being decisive, know what to focus on, knowing what to do when they want to be productive, knowing how to have a break and when to have a break, when to concentrate, when to call it quits for a while. The resilient youngsters have been able to manage themselves, be inventive and resourceful, cope with periods of boredom and spur themselves into activity and purpose. Human contact has been important, both real and virtual, and those who cope best seem to have had a link to school and someone who cares. In essence, the ones that have coped better have not needed to be spoon-fed. There are lots of examples of children setting themselves targets, perhaps in physical activity and limited space and learning, or new skills in art, or new skills in mathematics. Now, though it'll be unlikely to be research, there are lots of examples of children finding interesting, absorbing and challenging learning from website offerings from different schools, and of children having a go at learning provided for year groups well in advance of their own. Now, these examples of children taking initiative and driving their own learning receive little attention alongside the reasonable concern about those who have suffered. Yet there might be an indication here in the way we could think about the coming period of possibly disrupted schooling. The learner needs to see themselves as the driver of their learning rather than the passenger. Learning at home so that we are creating a resource to use in school might be an answer, but they create data for use in maths, observations to use in geography or science, analysis of a range of historical document facsimiles to use in history as pupils compare different sources. How about trainee teachers befriending, in learning terms, small numbers of pupils to support them online and learn about child development and learn about theory close up? Chepstow, where this is being hosted, is on the edge of a nation that is on the edge of the reform of schooling. If you don't know what's happening in Wales, it would be worth a look. In Wales, the curriculum threshold is right on the edge of better schooling. The curriculum needs pedagogy that is appropriate to make it happen. The last few months have offered clues. I'm working on the idea of an open school agenda, an exercise in collaboration, online super sessions picked up by schools by teachers who have a relationship with the children to do applied learning, gathering youngsters together in different communities to explore learning, inter-school gatherings of pupils with particular expertise facilitated by online communities and working for real purposes of real audience, supported by teachers who know them well. Anyone who is a teacher knows that this year their work has been valued and appreciated, though at times it doesn't feel like it. There's more respect for schooling and teachers than is often realised. Some of what you hear this evening will be tangible, feasible, and some of it will feel like pies in the sky. We have a chance. Our young people deserve the system to do some real blue sky thinking, to reach for some stars, to take things forward and build on what we've learned. Keep doing good things, enjoy the profession, and thanks for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mick. That was very insightful thoughts into what's been going on at the moment and what could happen. I especially like the online super sessions, which is a very fascinating subject to explore further. Thank you very much, Mick. And again, apologies about the technical delay. It's just a day where Teams and Zoom have decided to play against each other, but we are definitely on a fix now and we're getting that all sorted out. So thanks again, Mick, for that. Our next presenter is Abdul Chohan. Abdul has been a visionary on mobile learning for a number of years now, and has spoken to thousands of educators and decision makers across the world, and talking about adding value to their learning through using technology. So we're again very honoured to have Abdul as a presenter today. I'll pass you straight to Abdul.
Hi everyone, my name is Abdul Chohan. I am the Vice President of Learning at Showbie Inc. Some of you might know what Showbie is, some of you might not. I'll kind of explain as I go along. I'm a former chemistry teacher. I've been part of a senior leadership team for many years as well. And also I have been a principal of a high school for a short while as well. For the last 4 years, I've been working with lots of different schools in the UK and internationally, and very much looking at the way in which technology can support, enhance, amplify education and learning. And I think it's fair to say, following on from some of the things that Mick said earlier, that the world has seen a significant increase in the use of technology, not just for education, but actually generally. There's a whole host of technology companies that have kind of, you know, in terms of share prices and so on, have kind of rocketed because people have been using technology to kind of communicate, to kind of do things that they weren't able to do in the past, or they were able to do in the past, but they've never really accessed it in this way. Recently, I've been working on a training model that people will be very familiar with. Is the Mandinak and Klein model, and it kind of talks about how people, when they're initially faced with technology, they can be kind of quite in this survival stage where they don't really know how to use it and what to do, and then they kind of play around with it, press buttons, see things, how things work, how things don't work. And then that then moves them onto this kind of mastery level. And from there, once they've mastered the basic concepts, they then begin to use it for impact and for it to actually make a difference. And once they get to this impact level, we then kind of see that, you know, they can then begin to innovate. They then begin to bring in efficiencies. They can then begin to do things that they simply weren't able to do in the past. And I think certainly from my perspective, this whole Mandinak and Klein kind of development model, it's something that I've kind of seen happen across the world, across all sectors, even with people using technology on their own personal basis. They've kind of gone through this survival, mastery, impact, and innovation stage. I think one of the big things that I've seen in terms of my role and working with educators from the UK, from an international context as well, is the use of voice and video. I've been an advocate of using technology for digital feedback, voice feedback, and so on for many years. I wrote a paper for the Chartered College, I think 2 years ago almost now, that kind of talked about the use of digital feedback. And I think there was a time when technology was not simple and it was not reliable. And, you know, often people spent far too much time getting training and support and trying to figure things out. But I think we live in and exist in a time now where actually, to a degree, technology has become simple and reliable. And I think that there are certain efficiencies that can be brought into education. And I think with my role at Shobi, one of the things that we've been really looking at in some depth has been very much around the use of digitized feedback. You know, being able to annotate with voice over student work and student submission has been quite a powerful thing. And we've seen a lot of schools really make use of that over the last year. We've also seen things like screen recording and teachers being able to model examples and impact pedagogy in that way. That's also been something that's been quite powerful. And I think that, you know, potentially for the last so many years, we've seen almost death by PowerPoint in terms of education in the classroom, lots of slides and stuff that are kind of sent over to students or the teacher presents from. But I think at the very least we should, and I'm guessing here now, but we should be able to see some degree of change there where these kind of static slides can turn into little podcast videos where teachers have recorded their voice and their explanations and annotations over the top of this. And I think what's been powerful about this is when this is then accessed from home and parents can view this, we then find parents are in a better position to support their children's learning. And that's been a challenge through this pandemic. And, you know, many parents have taken to social media to kind of talk about this and so on, and you know, express their frustrations and so on. But I do feel that there are approaches that we can now build into education that doesn't focus necessarily on the technology. It still focuses on the learning. It focuses on what we know about what works in education, everything from, taking complicated concepts, breaking them down into smaller pieces and chunks, and chunking learning and sequencing lessons and so on, as well as things like retrieval practice and so on. But I think a lot of that can be done in a way that actually gives access to students continually and after the event, after the lesson. I was a chemistry teacher for many years. Students would come in and they would literally be they'd have to be my lesson at that time on a Monday morning for them to hear about group 1 metals from me and me explaining it in detail and so on. Actually, that can be captured now, along with the students' questions, along with what I'm putting up on the screen, and it's not complicated to do that. And the whole thing gets turned into a video. And also, there's some very simple things that have happened in technology that has kind of made this more accessible. So there was a time when you made videos using technology, when you finish the video, you would get asked lots of questions. What file name is this? What format do you want it in? What frame rate? And actually, there was most people would probably get stuck at the first or second question and think, hey, this is kind of not for me. However, we now have a variety of different tools like Loom, for example. It's the free version teachers can use. Inshobi has a record screen functionality that's built into it. Schools that are using things like iPads, they have screen record built into it and so on. There are lots of free tools that are very, very simple, that don't ask difficult questions and can kind of do this very, very easily. Explain Everything is another one that comes to mind that does this very, very well. So I do feel that the workflow and the way in which teaching and learning happens post-COVID can be significantly different. And I do think that there are opportunities to kind of change that. Rather than continuing to do the wrong things really well, I think that there can certainly be a shift when we kind of return to some normality. So teaching, it has been one aspect, and how students access that and how students can submit their work. Teachers have been having conversations about authenticity. How do we know that the children haven't just looked it up, and so on. But I do feel, again, with technology, students can speak and explain things, and it's easy to add voice notes and record things. So yes, pen to paper is still important. Final exams are pen to paper, but actually being able to annotate over the top of that with voice, these kinds of that kind of functionality becomes really powerful, brings a degree of authenticity, confidence. The cognitive demand for that kind of activity can be significantly higher because students have to be fluent. They've got to be able to explain their answer and so on. The other aspect to this, and the other type of conversations that I've been having, have been very much around assessment. And I do feel that in that particular area, there's a whole host of technology that really allows us to do things that we just simply couldn't do before. So in the past, I may have been asking questions. Have you understood this? Checking on learning and so on. And I might get a few heads nodding, or I might get some hands going up in the classroom and so on. Or actually, from a remote perspective, maybe a few students might answer on Zoom or Teams or whatever we're using. But actually, there's far more powerful tools. And then Shobi has a sister tool called Socrative, which is an assessment tool. You can use the free version of it to kind of try it out, but actually hugely powerful. You can ask questions of all students. You can see immediate responses and so on as well. So there's a variety of things that you can do and very successfully. And actually, it will automate reports. There are a variety of tools that will automate reports and give you question level analysis and give you the detailed feedback for each student. It will tell you the spread of correct and incorrect answers and so on. And I think that can then be used, that type of data can then be used to inform the next stage of planning and so on. So I do feel more than ever now that the way in which the educators, teachers on the whole across the world have been using mobile technology to influence learning and to kind of amplify learning processes as well as assessment is significantly more powerful, and there's a greater awareness around that. And I'm very hopeful that as we move forward and return to some degree of normality, that these kind of advantages that we've seen, these efficiencies that we've seen with technology are embraced, and they become part and parcel of an excellent kind of workflow. So, I mean, that's kind of it from me. I can kind of go on, but I'm kind of conscious of time as well. One last thing I will say is that everything that I've spoken about now, I kind of describe as the plumbing. We also have to think about taps. So taps, what I call devices, yeah? So there's lots of different devices and so on. And I know the government, certainly in England, they were kind of really thinking about access to devices. And I don't think it's something that our government has really been serious about compared to other countries where, you know, it's part and parcel of the education system. It's funded, every student gets a device and so on. And in some ways, getting a device is actually quite easy because you're giving out devices and so on, whatever that might be, laptops, iPads, and so on. But I think the harder part, so I describe devices like taps, shiny, turn them on, we expect water to come out. But actually, it's the plumbing that we really need to think about. What I feel, and that's kind of, you know, the pedagogy, the access, the learning, how do I use technology to kind of, you know, how do I design learning with these new tools that I have? How can I ask 30 students questions and get responses within 5 seconds and know exactly who has answered and who hasn't, and where the spread of incorrect answers are? That kind of stuff is the things that the plumbing, the technology will kind of bring and amplify. What I feel COVID has done is it's allowed people to really kind of get to grips with the plumbing. Unfortunately, we haven't always had access to the taps. And that's kind of, that's a challenge. And I do feel that, you know, nationally that a challenge needs to be addressed. I don't think it should be a question anymore. Historically, I find myself, it's strange me saying this now, because before COVID, I always used to say it the other way around. Hey, you know, lots of schools are giving out devices, but have you thought about the plumbing and the planning and how technology can actually make an impact and so on in terms of your, you know, pedagogical processes and so on. But actually, I think that's the thing that COVID has kind of trained teachers, or at least at the very least got them to dip their toes in and kind of experience some potential benefits that could be brought back into the classroom. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening to me. And if you kind of want to know more about Shobi, or you want to kind of speak to me anymore, I've got questions about anything that I've said, then you can reach me on abdul@shobi.com. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Abdul, for that. As I said, you know, our Deputy Head Benson will summarise at the end and pick out some main points. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on. Next, we have Kat Kuchar. Kath is a head teacher at Jubilee Park in Newport. Kat has led the development of the national reform with Jubilee Park, placing a great emphasis on professional learning and the use of Hub. And the Thrive curriculum is based upon the curriculum for Wales. Kat believes in the importance of igniting passion for learning, not only in the children, but also within staff and across the wider community. So I'll pass you straight to Kat. Thank you.
Okay, so as Jamie said, I'm Kat Kuchar, head teacher at Jubilee Park Primary School in Newport. I've been on a very fast journey over the last few years. We opened as a brand new school in September 2017, and I think when you think about an education landscape post-COVID, I would say that right from the start, we've been focused on igniting that passion for learning and basing our school on all the national reforms. For me, we have to remain learning focused. And I think Jamie mentioned, or Matt mentioned at the beginning, about how brave should we be? And I think we have such a potential to be brave in education in Wales. We have a national reform agenda that's world leading. And I think we need to appreciate that as a profession. And particularly when we look at the aspects as, say, the national mission, the school as learning organisations, curriculum for Wales. We need to be learning focused, and you might say, okay, that's a really strange thing to say for schools to be learning focused, but quite often schools focus on the wrong things. For me at Jubilee Park, our mission and our vision drive everything that we do. And you can see on the screen there, vision, curriculum and professional learning all being linked together. What's going well with us? I think our curriculum is based on all of the recommendations in Curriculum for Wales, and it's called our Thrive curriculum because we really want children to thrive in a transforming world. Our assessment is not separate to our curriculum. Our assessment is learning focused and focused on individual children, and it's focused on progress. It's not about following a set metric or making sure children get to where they should be at, say, the end of year 4, the end of year 6. It's really about ensuring children are progressed in their learning and that teachers know where they are. Obviously, teachers need great professional learning and development for that to happen. And for me as the head teacher, it's about really encouraging that teacher agency, a collective understanding of Curriculum for Wales, and having time to talk, time to research, time to trial, and time to trust. And I stick by the mantra, and this definitely goes into post-COVID world, that every pupil deserves a great teacher, not by chance, but by design. And it really is our job as school leaders to be designing our teachers, and particularly the teachers of the future. Mick touched on this in the keynote to open about developing that language of learning and children having those capacities of knowing how they are as learners, and I think that is so important. We spend a lot of time with our children talking about learning, modelling the language of learning, and providing those opportunities for children to reflect on themselves as learners, both in the learning process and at the end of learning processes. To me, it's all about slowliness, and I'm a real advocate of this knowledge, of this idea of a slowliness approach to learning. It's not about what we do or how we do it, it's about why we do what we do, and it's about that vision and the culture of learning, which starts with school leaders. Now more than ever, our staff, our children and our communities are looking for us and looking at us to see what we can provide, whether that's homeschooling, whether that's online learning, whether that's a hub provision, or for us now preparing for our youngest children to return to school. And it's all about making sure we have that behaviour for learning in place, an environment for learning which we can maintain in periods of change. So enabling that culture of learning to happen whether children are in school or outside of school. And obviously that relies on great relationships, building those relationships, not just between teachers and children, but with the whole school community. And for me, that goes back to communication. So important to have clear and honest communication. Hub is a fantastic tool to enable us to do that digitally, but also making sure we're building that communication and relationships in person where we can. And for me, then, it's all about purpose. Having that slowliness to learning always goes back to your why. What drives you as an individual or as a professional? Our behaviours, our collective action, all goes back to why we do what we do, why we're in it. And for me, it's about in it for the learning and making sure we're promoting that learning. You may have heard lots of talk in the media, lots of talk out there about us catching up, about a recovery curriculum, and you can see I put lines through them because I fundamentally don't believe that a world post-COVID is about catch-up or about recovery. I think it's about making sure our children thrive. I don't believe it should be about our schools staying open longer hours or being open during holiday periods, and our children certainly don't need to be full of information when they return to school. They need to be inspired and nurtured. We know that children learn from everything around them, the people, the environment, the atmosphere, routine, experiences, opportunities. And now more than ever, we need to give children time to engage in these activities and opportunities, to reflect on themselves as learners and to see how they are in the learning process. They need time to play, to laugh, to fall out and to argue, and to be outside in the fresh air. And most of all, they need that time to think about learning. And one thing I would really advocate and what I would really promote here tonight is for you to consider whether learning in your school is a race or whether it's not a race. For me, learning is not a race. It is vital children are nurtured and supported to develop learning at their appropriate pace. And it's crucial that teachers know when to support that learning, to recognise where children are in their learning journey and be able to support them to move on. At Jubilee Park, we don't follow set schemes of work, we don't plough through things to tick them off a list, and we don't have set times on which themes are delivered and taught. What we do have is trust and flexibility in learning, with a clear importance on literacy, numeracy and digital competence. We need to ensure learning is driven by children's needs and abilities rather than external pressures. We don't want to rush to break time to make sure things are put in books just to satisfy external accountability measures. We need to be able to take time to make sure learning goes beyond that surface level, promoting a deeper learning. We use the inquiry approach quite a lot in our school to promote that and to develop a spiral approach to learning, to make sure that children have the opportunity to revisit learning at deeper processes and at deeper points as they move through the school. And all of this goes back to that school culture I started off talking about at the beginning. A school culture which places trust in teachers so they can organise learning in a way which is best for their children, therefore allowing that slowness of learning to take place. Our approach to assessment and progression really supports that, and it's not a top-down from myself as the head teacher saying this is what you need to do. It's about making sure we have high expectations which are really focused on the progress in learning to enable children to thrive in a changing world. Wellbeing matters. You can see my muddy, dirty feet there. And I think if this time has taught us anything, it's taught us that wellbeing really does matter. And I'm not talking about a tokenistic wellbeing day or take your PPA at home next week. It's about cultural change and really focusing on what matters in education. We have our future generation in front of us. We've got problems with sustainability. We've got pandemics across the, a global pandemic. We need to see the big picture. We need to make sure that in schools we're not driven by accountability. It's not about proving our worth. It is about process. It is about progress. And most of all, it's about learning for our children. For me, this starts with leadership, and I am a keen advocate, and I try my hardest of putting my own oxygen mask on first, getting outside, taking the time to do my running and to do the things that I need to do, because it's only by doing that will we actually have the stamina to cope with all the changes in the world that's ahead of us. I think we must take the positives from this time and we must work together. You can see a quote there from Obama, and thinking about we mustn't be afraid to ask questions, we must be brave, we must think differently, and we must be able to challenge each other and be prepared to learn new things. I'm just going to end with my favourite quote. If any of my members of staff are online, they'll have seen this a million times. And for me, this is the world post-COVID. It's our duty as professionals. We have such an amazing profession, and I'm so proud to be in the profession that I'm in. But I think for us, we need to recognise 4 key things. We need to make sure we stay true to our vision, why we do what we do. It isn't about an end product, but about the process. And then it's about the impact that has on our children. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Kat. That was absolutely fascinating. I thought that was really refreshing. I love the term slowness of learning, and I love your thoughts on the deficit approach and the thrive approach when we do have the pupils back in school. So thank you very much, Kat.
Thank you, diolch.
Okay, next we have Gareth Evans. Gareth Evans is the Director of Education at University of Wales Trinity St David's, and Gareth specialises in design, development and implementation of education policy, especially in the Welsh context. Gareth has written extensively on Wales education system since devolution, and you often see Gareth pop up on HTV Wales, giving his thoughtful insights. And I was lucky enough to share 2 trips with Gareth over the last 3 years, one to Glasgow, one to Holland, looking at the education systems. So I really appreciate Gareth coming on, and looking forward to hear what he's going to say.
Thank you, Jamie. Hopefully people can see my slides.
Yeah, we can, Gareth.
Good. Let me just put that into a slightly better, more convenient view. There we go. Great. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you to you and Matt and colleagues at Chepstow for inviting me tonight and for convening this event. Now, as others have said already, there are some things we'd like to keep as a result of the COVID situation, and other things that we'd rather lose from our education system. My presentation will take, as you can probably imagine, a policy perspective, and I'll focus predominantly on our appetite for change. Do we really want it? To begin, I want to look at 2 things that remain high on the agenda in Wales: technology and qualifications. Now, when the international PISA tests were last taken by teenagers in Wales in 2018, the OECD also asked questions of school leaders, who were invited to complete a questionnaire on parental engagement, school climate and resources. A quick review of the survey outcomes recently led me to this. In relation to ICT policies and procedures, head teachers were asked whether their school had any of the following: a specific scheme to prepare students for responsible internet behaviour, its own written statement about the use of digital devices, and so on. As you can see, Wales outperformed the OECD average against each of these measures. In some areas, Wales was in fact 37% better off than the OECD average. So we were well placed, you would have thought, for online and distance learning. But if we move on to the next slide, you can see a very different picture beginning to emerge. In nearly every case, schools' preparedness for using ICT was lower in Wales than the OECD average. 49% of heads in Wales said their school's internet bandwidth or speed was sufficient, compared to 68% in the rest of the OECD. 45% agreed that the number of digital devices for teaching was sufficient, compared to 59% across the OECD. These data suggest that even before the pandemic, Wales had issues with technology, and this chimes with the anecdotal evidence we've all seen and heard since. That so many children in Wales haven't been able to access education remotely through no fault of their own is a real blight on our society, and a real problem for our teachers and educators trying to engage their pupils from a distance. I'm going to move on now to another hot topic of debate, qualifications, and more specifically, the future of GCSEs. Now, anyone who's read my stuff over the years will know that I'm not a great fan of GCSEs. With 9 in 10 learners extending their education beyond the age of 16, and with so many variables in the system now, between countries, between cycles, and between subjects themselves, we need to be thinking about a new award for school leavers. Something more in keeping with our new purpose-based curriculum, and something that takes a more holistic view of learner progression. But I'm not convinced we have the appetite for change. Nearly a decade ago, in its last major consultation on the future of post-16 qualifications, the Welsh Government chose to retain GCSEs and A-levels, but noted that in the longer term, there is a case for considering new types of qualification. 9 years later, in its consultation document launched just last month, Qualifications Wales once again prolonged the life of GCSEs and instead called for a change in their content and assessment. Now, the main rationale for retaining GCSEs appears to be the value and strength of the GCSE brand. They've been around for 30 years, they're tried and tested, and people know what they're going to get. But given divergence in policy, divergence in curricula, and the erosion of public and professional confidence resulting from last year's grading fiasco, then surely now is as good a time as any to reconsider the place of GCSEs in our education system. Which brings me on to my next question and the focus of this short presentation. The phrase new normal is bandied about all the time at the moment, but just how new and how normal do we want our education system to be? If there is one good thing to come out of this dreadful situation, it's that it's given us the opportunity to fundamentally rethink the way we do things. It's given us space for reflection. Is our education system the best it can be? Do we cater for all needs? Do we value and appreciate each child's learning journey? And do we make the best use of the talent available to us? Or, as with technology and qualifications, will we paper over the cracks and carry on as we've always done? Now, I'm sure we all have a wish list of what we'd like to do differently and what we'd like to change post-COVID. And here's a little insight into some of my thinking. As discussed, I'd like us to see make much better use of technology to support teaching and learning, which invariably means better resourcing. I'd like to explore the principles of learner progression and consider a new approach to qualifications. And yes, that does mean looking again at GCSEs and A-levels. I'd like a rapid review of our curriculum for Wales. Has the pandemic changed anything, or is it simply reinforced what was already set out? I'd like to see more alignment between stakeholders with better integration of business and social care sectors. And with that, a more targeted and collaborative approach to reducing inequality. I'd like to see a review of school structures, better use of public funding, trimming the fat from an overcrowded middle tier. I'd like to see a more intelligent accountability system involving peer review and tiered quality assurance, and a national coaching and mentoring programme to support educators at every stage of their development, not just when they qualify. These are big asks, I know, but nothing is insurmountable. American philosopher Thomas Kuhn once said that fundamental change was reliant on two conditions: evidence that the old way of working was palpably failing, and that the new way of working is demonstrably better. The failure of existing rules, he said, is the prelude to a search for new ones. Personally, I think we can do both. We can prove that some things aren't working, and we have enough knowledge, experience, and creativity to do things better. We need a group of friendly agitators, educators who respond to problems with solutions, those who are willing to draw a line in the sand and make the case for change. As more and more people club together, momentum will build. The collective voice will grow ever louder. And it's through sessions like these, with the coming together of like-minded people from all sections of our system, that the snowball will gather speed. And in conclusion then, and continuing the snow analogy, change will only come about if we make it happen. But the opportunity to do so is finite and will soon melt away and disappear. It won't be long before we default back into what we know. This could be a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and we've got to take it before it's too late. And so we return to the original question. What will the educational landscape look like post-COVID? And for me, the answer is simple. Much the same, unless we're prepared to do something about it. Thank you for listening.
Diolch, Gareth. Thank you very much. Appetite for change, do we really have it? That's a really big question. Some lovely explorations of that. Thank you, Gareth, very much. Next we have Jon Jones. Jon Jones is the Director of Innovation at Royal Grammar School in Worcester and across several other schools. Jon unfortunately cannot be with us tonight, so Jon has sent a short video just describing the journey of his school and what's happened from March 2020.
Famous for the composer Elgar and Liam Perrin's Worcestershire sauce, Worcester is also home to the family of 4 RGS Worcester schools. Furthermore, we are the 6th oldest school on the planet. However, due to COVID-19, 2020 saw the classrooms in all 4 RGS Worcester schools fall silent for the first time in over 1,000 years. The global pandemic meant that schools had to think on their feet fast. Yet, having our digital learning program in place meant our teachers had the resources and the skills to do something incredible. Using the latest research, we compiled meaningful support guidelines for our teachers. Furthermore, we ensured that every single one of our 1,500 pupils knew their responsibilities before lockdown started. So when we moved to a full curriculum of teaching and learning remotely, they knew exactly what to do. We organised a series of bespoke CPD sessions to ensure our teachers knew the best possible ways and means to deliver lessons remotely. Then, on Monday, the 23rd of March 2020, all UK schools were closed to pupils. Would our pupils respond? Would our teachers cope? Would our parents be happy with the provision? Would the digital learning programme facilitate the outstanding practice we wanted to deliver? The answer, I am pleased to say, was a resounding yes. A crescendo of music continued to reverberate to all our pupils. An array of coding lessons meant their neural networks remained stimulated. Fun and engaging sports lessons ensured that teamwork, challenges and motivation were not lost, whilst DT lessons gave students creative opportunities that kept them inspired. In fact, we delivered over 18,000 remote lessons to over 1,500 pupils in all our curriculum subjects. We ensured our teachers stayed connected with weekly remote CPD sessions. And at the end of term, pupils, teachers and parents all agreed that by using cutting-edge digital technology, we managed to ensure learning was kept alive at the RGS Worcester family of schools.
Okay, thanks, Jon, for that and sending that presentation down. Next, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Neil Ingram from Bristol University. We've had real strong ties with Neil and Bristol University over a number of years, and we very much hope to keep that going. So I'm looking forward to Neil's presentation. Neil is a senior lecturer in science education at Bristol Uni. Is a lead coordinator of Eastgape's Hewlett-Packard Catalyst Initiative for Pedagogy 3.0. So very much forward to hearing what Neil's got to say.
Thank you, Jamie. Can you see me and hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Neil.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to try and share a screen. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, all good, Neil.
All good. Perfect. All right. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. Well, it's a delight to be here this afternoon for this very uplifting set of sessions. And the two words that I've picked up so far really are bold and brave. And I think that is the right way to think about the future. So a few years ago, I was invited by Hewlett-Packard, the computer company, to think about what pedagogy in schools would be like in a world that was equipped with Web 3.0, as they called it, that which we've got today. And we called that idea Pedagogy 3.0. So it's quite interesting to take it off the shelf again after a few years and see to what extent what we thought back then has come true. The first thing my student teachers said when they started online learning is it's not the same as face-to-face learning. And that was one of the things I think that we predicted in the Pedagogy 3 work, that technology is a force. It's not good or bad, but it's not neutral. And technology does change the way in which we work and we interact. As McLuhan said, the medium is the message. Teams does convey a message alongside the content of what you're trying to deliver. And what we've seen in England, which I suspect you probably won't necessarily want to replicate in Wales, is a rush to try and produce the same kind of experiences online as you get in the classroom. Very teacher-centered pedagogy, very focused on individual performance, very tightly controlled contexts. And I suppose the example that springs to mind of the epitome of this is the Michaela Community School in Wembley, North London, which is a very, very teacher-focused, very disciplined, ready-to-learn institution. And they've produced 20 rules for teaching online for their teachers and for their students. And they're trying to replicate their school experience in that space. Now, that may be not what you want to do. Maybe what you want to do is something which is more student-centered, more collaborative, where students are given more control over the scope and the content of their own work, where students take responsibility for when and how to use ICT to take responsibility for their own learning. And ICT allows you to do both of those things. They're different approaches, they're different pedagogies, but they're both possible. In a student-centered pedagogy, the teacher is still in control, but the controls are largely invisible. Now, the schools that I've been working with that have been developing these kind of ideas have been schools where they've given all their students iPads and really brought the technology into the heart of learning. And this is something that's been largely done in the younger years, in year 7 and year 8. By the time the students get to year 10, both English schools, exams are kicking in. Exam preparation is kicking in, and the whole approach becomes much more teacher-centered. And one of the things that we predicted Pedagogy 3 would do would be to empower teachers to use both approaches when it was appropriate and to move from one to the other seamlessly, what we called a versatile pedagogy. And a versatile pedagogy is really about empowering teachers to know when to give control to the students, how to do it, and then take it back again afterwards, even within the same learning session. And that, I think, is the way in which ICT should develop in a post-COVID world. Since we did Pedagogy 3, of course, there's been a whole series of new tools emerging, one of which is Teams, of course, and OneNote and OneNote Class Notebook, which are themselves learning ecosystems. They are places where teachers and students can work together in different kinds of pedagogy. And I see this kind of space as being flexible and versatile enough to allow teachers to develop styles that suit their students. So what will remain after COVID? I think ICT is not just for lockdowns and it's not just for snow days. But if it's going to be effective, we need to understand how the technology is impacting on students' learning and how we can use it to our best advantage. And I think that is what Pedagogy 3 is trying to do. So with that, I will return back to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Neil. I always look forward to listening to Neil, to what he has to say. And I know Neil's a big advocate of the Welsh curriculum, being based in England. And I love the term there, versatile pedagogy. That's something which we will really think about and develop. Thank you very much, Neil. Really appreciate that. Next, we have Bronwyn Rashid. Bronwyn is a head of training and enterprise at the OTR Bristol and Youth Mental Health Service across the Southwest. Welcome, Bronwyn, and looking forward to what you have to say.
I hope that I'm timing this right, because we are having slight technical issues at our end. So my name is Bronwyn, and I work for an organisation called Off the Record in Bristol, and we are a youth mental health service that has been running since the 60s. And we do things a little bit differently. So we work in conjunction with organisations such as CAMS and our local CCG and with all of our schools. But we approach mental health from a slightly different angle. And that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit with you in the time that I've got. I used to run something called the Resilience Lab, which was an open group for young people. And I would take it out into schools, to skate parks, to wherever I could find people in that kind of adolescent stage. And we would talk about how we would actually boost our resilience. And what's interesting in all that work that I've done and in the training that I do around this topic is that sometimes there's some misunderstandings around what resilience actually is. And it's kind of really relevant, particularly with the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm also going to think about kind of some particular mental health issues that we've noticed that are cropping up at the moment. So one of the big things is that well-being is basically fundamental, and it's really reassuring to actually hear so many other people saying that in their presentations. Last year, around about this time, just before the first lockdown, there was a report put out by Deloitte and Mind that was looking at the effect of mental health and staff burnout in terms of the financial cost within employment and in work. You can equally well apply that in schools. People don't learn if they're not feeling mentally well and safe, and if they're not being kind of responded to in that way. And what's also interesting is that before the pandemic happened, before any of the lockdowns happened, there was a huge report by the Co-op about youth loneliness. So 16 to 25-year-olds report the highest levels of feeling lonely in society. So more than older people, more than people when they've had a new baby, which are kind of potentially areas that we traditionally think of as being more affected. So we knew before any of this happened that loneliness was an issue. And there are 4 basic risk factors for loneliness. One of them is poverty and precarity. So precarity as in, not having a stable place or home or base. The second one is identity and feeling different. So obviously for adolescents, it's a time of real change and finding who they are and working that out. But the last 2 are kind of particularly relevant, thinking about returning to school or how we move forward. So the first one, the third risk is times of transition and change. So schools already do lots of really brilliant work in terms of managing the transition from primary to secondary and then from secondary out into the wider world. But obviously at the moment, we're all going through huge periods of transition and change. In fact, the entire of the last year has been just one constant change after another. And then the final risk factor is to do with feelings of failure and the pressure to succeed, which I think is particularly interesting when we look at education. And the other thing that sort of happened this year is well, I mean, the best way to explain it is I've done a huge amount of workshops going into many secondary schools. And I always used to talk about failure. Used to talk about this idea of success. And one question I would always ask is, you know, if you fail your GCSEs, do you think that this is the only time, the only opportunity that you get to go through this exam? And despite what messages they were getting from the school, despite anything that teaching staff might have said, a large proportion of those young people were absolutely convinced that these exams were kind of like a cliff, you know, that this was a moment, a boundary, and if things didn't go right at this point, then that meant something long term. Obviously, we all know that's not true, but that was the kind of narrative, that was the message that was out there. Now, over the last year, our young people have seen that having been told that these exams are super important and kind of non-negotiables, actually they can get completely taken away, and there are other ways of managing. So that narrative's changed. You know, things about like even uniform and what we look like and how we present ourselves and what work actually looks like has completely changed. Perfectionism is sort of going out of the window. So it'll be really interesting how we manage those ideas around feelings of failure and that pressure to succeed, because actually what success looks like now is probably quite different. I know, for example, that OVO, a big employer in Bristol, have now said permanently that their staff can choose how they're going to work. So they can work from home, they can work in the office, and it's all becoming a lot more relaxed and quite different. So any kind of return to school, any transition needs to really think about well-being and put that at the centre, because people don't learn if they're not feeling safe. What I also think is perhaps sometimes missing, and I haven't quite heard it yet this afternoon, and I think it's really key, and it's basically putting young people's voice at the centre of this, so asking them what they actually need. We obviously have a huge amount of expertise, there's a lot of knowledge, there's research, but what seems to always kind of really work when we kind of develop wellbeing packages, or when we look at promoting mental health, is putting that youth voice at the centre. And in fact, if you look at any of the resources coming out from Anna Freud, which are super useful, and if you want to kind of look more into this, I would thoroughly recommend signing up to their newsletter. But Anna Freud have kind of done some work recently about how whatever approach a school or a group of schools chooses, that if they put that youth voice in, and if they involve them and they co-produce that work together, it is much more effective long term. So that's kind of, you know, that's something that I think, and off the record, that we firmly believe that the youth voice should be at the centre of what we do. What's also really interesting is that resilience, so one of the most kind of, I suppose, underrepresented resilient qualities is the ability to be able to ask for help, so seeking support, and also knowing when something isn't worth continuing trying with. So I think sometimes we talk about resilience and we think about this idea of persevering no matter what. And actually, resilient people are really good at recognising when something's not working. So it's great hearing all the different sort of approaches this afternoon around this idea that actually what we need to stop and what we need to kind of continue with. And what we've seen off the record in terms of the trends of young people seeking support from us is that it's really variable. So there are some young people that we were working with who are really struggling with things like anxiety and low mood and all sorts of those kind of negative mental health aspects. Some of those have actually not needed our support at all over the last year, because they're not having to go to school, which was the environment that was actually making them feel those feelings. And then some young people are actually coming into our services which weren't before, because they're lacking the support that they used to get at school, or the peer support and those relationships. So that is the sort of the final message that I would kind of put out there, is that resilience isn't, it's not like one recipe for all of us. And in terms of kind of building a future and changing the way that we kind of look at schools and the way we think about education, having that ability to be person-centered, to recognise that each young person is unique and might need something subtly different, is going to be really fundamental. And then the last thing that I would say is that we are, I suppose we've always got a little bit of a social justice angle at our work, because we say that often when people are having a reaction to something, if they're feeling low or angry or depressed or anxious, actually they're having a healthy response to an unhealthy environment. So it's not that the problem is with the individual and that they have like a mental health problem, that actually they're having a completely rational reaction to a very difficult situation that doesn't suit them. So it might be thinking more about kind of how we create that space where there is that flexibility to keep the things that suit some young people, and to maybe like offer options for those other young people where other things are going to be important. And just so you know, we offer training and all sorts of different levels of support to schools in England and in Wales as well. So please get in touch if you ever need us. I'm going to stop there because I know that I've probably spoken for long enough.
Bronwyn, thank you very much for presenting tonight. And again, it just shows that the well-being of the pupils are at the very heart of everything we are and should be doing, and especially when we're planning for the return, and that just puts it back into perspective. Thank you very much, Bronwyn, much appreciated. Next we have Matt Pullant. Now, I know Matt for a number of years now. We used to meet on the sort of teach meet sort of at schools experiences, and Matt is local to Chepstow. Matt's actually now a parent. He has a boy in school, and we very much welcome Matt to helping with us in school, and our staff are looking at new technologies and how technology can help and support learning. Matt is a senior lecturer at the University of South Wales, USW, and also company director of Think Creative Consultancy. And Matt is a prominent speaker on the circuit in terms of a big advocate of how technology supports learning. So I'll pass you straight over.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, thanks for having me this evening, and really enjoyed all of the sessions so far, and hoping that what I say tonight supports and complements lots of those things. The angle I wanted to think about really is from a reflective point of view of learning from what we've seen over the last year. And I suppose, being a professional learning specialist, I've had the great opportunity to work closely with schools over the last year and see what works and what hasn't worked, and not through anyone's fault, but through people trying lots of different things. And really today, looking at going beyond emergency solutions that we all kind of had to adopt back in March to long-term transformation of education. Now, one thing that I wanted to highlight as part of the presentation today is the one second, the screen seems to have frozen on me. There we go. Is the fact that we are very, very lucky in Wales to have a national platform called Hub. And one thing to highlight is Hub is a cloud-based solution to the things that we're trying to deal with at the moment. And what that brings with it then is opportunities to engage in other cloud-based solutions such as Microsoft 365 and Adobe Spark and G Suite, offering schools and students access to technology that might support them in their learning. And the thing to take away from that is that all of these cloud-based solutions work on any device. So they're not prescriptive to a specific device. They'll work on absolutely anything, meaning that whether students have a laptop, a desktop PC, a tablet, a phone, or even, as we've realized recently, Xboxes and PlayStations, students can access all of these tools. So what comes with that then is, how are we using those tools to support our students in terms of their pedagogy? I firmly believe that technology shouldn't be a barrier, and it also shouldn't just be access to stuff. It really should be a window to explore the world in new ways and share learning like never before. We know that students may have access to desktops, and we know that desktops are quite restrictive. They're stationary. They mean that we have to stay in one location all the time. We also know that those students may have access to laptops, and although they are a portable device, they're not necessarily a mobile device. We still need to be stationary when we're accessing those tools. And finally, we've seen that students can access through mobile devices, be that a mobile phone or through tablet devices. And what we see here is a different opportunity for students to be able to engage with the world around them. And like in this picture of my son, explore the world in a way that maybe they can't do through other technology sources. And in doing that, that allows them to transform how they engage and how they learn. And the way we learn is as unique as our fingerprints. And something that we've definitely seen over this last year is, as students are working at home and away from their teachers, they have started to uncover different ways that they want to learn. The flexibility of not necessarily being tied to a curriculum, tied to a timetable, time to break times, means that sometimes if they're really engaged in a subject, they will go through a lunchtime, they will go beyond 3:30, because they don't have that fixed parameter of when and where they're learning. And the key thing here is to make sure that as leaders, we understand that there are students that work in this way, and it's not necessarily the traditional way of learning, but it is definitely unique to them. I remember a conversation with an ex-student of mine at university who talked about her 4 children, and 3 of her children were coping fine, but one of her children either, was struggling because of the lack of access to school, and she wanted them to get back to a more, traditional approach. And she was focusing on the student who was struggling as opposed to the 3 that were thriving. And my retort to that was, maybe those 3 were struggling the whole time that school existed in its old format. This is a reflection on World Economic Forum. This has been recently updated for the top skills required by the workplace in 2025. And I noticed in the questions someone had asked about this. These are the top 10 skills that people are asking for in the workplace. And it's important to think about how do we bring out these skills in our students, as well as support them with the knowledge and experiences that school brings them, but to know that they leave with not just qualifications, but they leave with skills to be able to do more. And one thing that I'm really, really passionate about is thinking to who has actually struggled in this last year, but who has actually thrived. And it is the students with self-motivation, persistence and independence that have thrived. They've really taken this opportunity to learn in a different way, in a different environment, supported by their school, but not in that traditional classroom-based experience. So I wanted to move on then to the importance around student agency and choice, and the difference that that makes when you engage students. And other speakers tonight have all spoken about this area as well, in terms of this co-creation and how students can engage in this process. And when we provide agency, we really do see a difference in how our students engage in the learning around them. And one thing that we've definitely seen is when we remove the barriers to learning, and not just the barriers in terms of access, but the barriers in terms of how students engage in the content from their teachers, but equally how the students have removed barriers in how they present their work to teachers. We see students really start to thrive because they have a voice. They have a voice that isn't just writing in books and having evidence written and recorded in their documents in a traditional way. Let's take this example. So we could ask our students to create an Excel spreadsheet that shows rainfall in your town. And as a result of that, students will have completed the task. But actually, if we reframe the question slightly to take into account what we actually want the students to do in terms of problem solving and thinking about the skills that they're being asked to do, if we ask them to show the impact of rainfall in your town using data, well, that could be a video. We're still using data, we're still demonstrating impact, but we're taking it further in terms of our critical thinking and our problem solving, because we've given them the tools to do something in a way that isn't the traditional way of, representing data in graphs. And in this creative way of learning, students can really start to excel and express their learning. This way definitely shows understanding of the information and application of the knowledge that they have. Now, there's a lot of information on here, and I'm not going to ask you to read it all, but I'm going to highlight the key things. Students having an active role in what they do and how they learn have greater motivation. And not only that, but they're more likely to have learnt how they learn best, a skill that they can then utilise in lots of other areas going forward. And this comes massively through the power of creativity. And I'm going to pose a question really to everyone listening. How do you see the difference between engagement and compliance? And I ask you to think about some of the students in your class, which are always there and are always doing what they've asked to do. But actually, once they're at home, do they still comply when you're taken out of the equation? How have students engaged in learning over this last year in a different way? Because let's face it, when they're not in school, they don't have to learn. So there's definitely things that you've done as educators that have engaged students to want to learn and not just do it because they're in the classroom at that time. One thing that I've been looking at a lot over the last few years, and something that's really become relevant now, is this idea of universal design for learning, and an important thing when it comes to creating resources and creating ways for students to access things. And when we break this down, it forms 3 separate areas. The first area is the area around the why. So why am I learning? What is it that's wanting me to want to do any of this learning in the first place? What is it that's engaged me in the process? And in Wales, we're really rich with the fact that our curriculum looks towards context and real world application. The second area then is the area around what? The content knowledge. What is it that students learn? But not only in terms of what, in terms of the things, but how do I access the what? How do teachers create that information? Is it through video? Is it through podcasts? Is it through modelling of those things? And then finally, and something probably which is the most important, how? How do students demonstrate their learning to us? Now, the traditional method is that they write it down in books and we measure it by what's written down. But that's a barrier to learning for so many, because it could be an ALN need, it could be an EAL need. But if we remove that as a barrier, but still give them the tools to communicate their thinking, who knows what they could actually show us. So just in conclusion then, let's think about what we want our learners to do. Is it that we want our learners to think about the learning or the technology? So let's start with pedagogy and not ICT lessons. Otherwise, there's a danger that everything we teach becomes an ICT lesson. Remove the barriers to learning through informed choice. So making sure that the students know the range of ways that they can demonstrate knowledge and understanding. The world does not need everybody to have to write their answers down. It needs people to be able to communicate their answers. And in a world of technology, there are multiple ways to communicate your responses. We want students to really focus on the outcomes, not the output. Do we judge them on the quality of their handwriting, or do we judge them on the content that they've written down? Equally, if we ask them to create a video, do we judge them on their ability to make a video, or do we judge them on the content that they're trying to express in that video? And let's truly engage our learners in the learning. We have an opportunity now with a rich curriculum which is going to be guided by the schools to actually think about things that are relevant to our students in a world that's ever changing. And then finally, don't see technology as a distance learning fix. It is just as valid in the classroom to give students a voice. I'm sure many of you have noticed in Teams calls or Zoom chats that quiet child all of a sudden has a voice because there's a chat window and they don't have to put their hand up in person. And if we take that back into the classroom and allow them a voice through technology, it can hugely change how they engage with learning. This is one of the most dangerous terms that's always floats around in education that I hear all too often. We've always done it that way. Well, I think there's definitely an opportunity now to change that approach and think about this in a whole new way, and think about how technology from a leadership point of view becomes a strategic integration into education to give us new opportunities for our learners. Thank you very much.
So beyond emergency solutions to long-term transformation, that was absolutely fascinating, and really enjoyed that presentation. I love that penultimate slide with the list of things that you highlighted, and I'm already going to use that for some of our professional learning in school. So thanks, Matt, and really thank you for your time this evening. We move on now to our 9th out of 10 presenter, and this is Jordan Ingalls. Jordan Ingalls is a final year ITE student at the University of South Wales, and she brings all the all-important student-teacher perspective. So looking forward to what Jordan has to say.
Good evening, everyone. Hopefully you can see my presentation. So I just want to quickly say thank you for inviting me, as this is a great opportunity for me as a student teacher. So recently, in November of last year, I carried out an action research project on how to motivate foundation phase learners to engage with home learning. I particularly focused on mathematics, and I decided to look at this area as I think it was a problem that lots of people in the whole country and globally are facing, and not just in my class. So I think that home learning has been a struggle for everyone. I also decided to look at maths as it was highlighted in the most recent ASTIM report and as a target in the school's development plan. Lastly, the reason for this action research project is I think that blended learning is really important, and Welsh Government has highlighted this in the new curriculum and said that it should be an ongoing approach and not just an approach to COVID, as it has the potential to maximise learning and professional development. So firstly, I had to carry out some research. So I turned to Twitter, where I asked different practitioners how they motivated children to engage with home learning, and I did receive some fantastic response, so thank you if any of those were you. Similarly, I did ask many practitioners in the local area what they thought were effective approaches for engaging children in home learning. Again, I received very similar responses to the Twitter responses. I carried out some research, which you can read in my literature review, which I'll show you where that is later, where I found out the importance of co-construction of learning and student voice, and how it is really important to include learners in their own learning process. And lastly, my research, in the research process, I carried out some interviews with the children and asked them why they weren't engaging with their home learning. So I received some of the standard responses, whereas they just didn't want to engage with their home learners, they had other interesting things to do, or they were a multi-child household and were struggling to share devices, or mainly many of the children said that they didn't receive much support from their parents as they were still working. So I came up with some responses to this. I introduced the Smiley scale to ask children how they felt about home learning, and shockingly, 72% of the class explained that home learning either made them feel sad or angry, leaving a small percentage of students feeling positive about their experience of home learning, which I think is actually really sad to hear as a student teacher or a practitioner, that children are struggling that much with home learning. So I carried out a focus group where I asked the children what things they'd like for us to create, what incentives would there be for them to engage with their home learning, and we came up with the idea of a home learning champion. So this was something that, again, could be used in a blended approach. So as we normally give children certificates and other incentives in class, these were all posted on our Google Classroom page. So this certificate you can see in the centre is actually animated. They had an animated poster, an animated sticker, they gained 5 dojo points, as well as many other incentives which we gave in school. But the main incentive they asked for was an announcement video, which I produced, and the children would log on online if they were in school, and if they were isolated, and be able to see who was the winner, or if they were in school, this was shown to the children. So then I carried out the project. So in the first week, I just allowed the class teacher to set the homework as normal, where 86% of the class, shockingly, did not engage with their home learning at all. So following on what I found out earlier about student voice and co-construction of learning, I asked some of the children to come up with ideas of what we could do to motivate them to engage. And they decided that as a class, they would vote every week on what topic and what theme they wanted for their homework. So this is just an example. So this here is actually the first week of the project, where the students decided that they wanted to practice adding 3-digit numbers and 2-digit numbers. This is the most difficult one. Again, the children got to choose their own difficulty for the task, which I think was really important. And the children decided that they wanted to count dash home for this particular project. Amazingly, after 4 short weeks of allowing the children to choose what they wanted to do for homework and using incentives to motivate them, it completely swapped. So whereas 86% of the children were originally not engaging, 86% of the class were now engaging, which I think is fantastic. So lastly, again, use the Smiley scale and asked the children how they felt about home learning. And amazingly, 95% of the class now said they were happy or excited to engage with home learning. So thank you for listening. Sorry, I was being a bit time conscious, but it was just hard to explain this project in 5 minutes, as I'm really passionate about it. So if you'd like to find out any more information about any of the approaches that I used in particular, or if you'd like me to share some of the resources, I'd be more than happy to. This is a copy of my ebook. It's not currently published, but if you follow my Twitter account, which is displayed at the bottom, as soon as it is published, I will put the link on there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jordan. I think you did an absolutely brilliant job of summing that up in 5 minutes. I love the themes about student choice and the voice and the co-construction. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing that, Jordan. Thank you very much. So we come to our last but not least, our final presenter, and we have James Wise from Cardiff High, who's assistant head teacher and also organiser of Research Ed Cymru. So looking forward, and I especially like the title of this presentation. So James, if you're ready, thank you.
Okay. Am I ready? Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see that, James. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, great. So yeah, this is the title of my presentation, really. Will there be a learning loss post-COVID, and will it actually matter? So I'll start with this. This is, this time last year, this is what school was, wasn't it? Really, it was a building and everything that happened inside the building. And where are we now? Well, a year later, when you think of school, it's perhaps this, isn't it? This crazy image of press play and pause, and you're on mute, and you're frozen, and download and upload, all that sort of stuff. But what I want to say really is that shift over the last year from one form of education to another, if you like, has been nothing short of perhaps miraculous, and the word I'm going to use is this Herculean effort, really, from all concerned, from I suppose from government down, really, isn't it? Schools, teachers, parents, and perhaps most importantly, pupils. But I think it's perhaps important to say that this hasn't been an easy ride by any means, and even where we are now is by no means perfect. Gareth made a point earlier about sort of the technological deprivation, I suppose, within Wales, and pupils not having devices. Even now, pupils are still being given devices, and upskilling staff in terms of pedagogy. So how, okay, we sort of teach in the classroom, how are we teaching online? I think making that transition has been a big effort as well, and certainly well-being and mental health well-being we've heard about tonight of pupils. And what I'd argue is that I think during this past year, I can use this sort of phrase, this diminished educational diet. And I think, I'm not saying online learning is not going to work full stop, but I'm saying what's happened in the past year, getting to grips with things, is people have suffered from a diminished educational diet. Not every pupil, but I'd say in general, I don't think that's a controversial thing to sort of argue. And this research was published by the EEF sort of last month, and sort of one of the key, well, quite a few takeaways, but this was a key takeaway for me from Becky Francis, that said, the new research offers compelling evidence there will be a large negative impact on learning, and significantly with disadvantaged pupils suffering the most. And that's, the lockdown 1 and without even looking at sort of lockdown 2, really, I suppose. And I think that is significant, that negative impact on learning, which then leads to this question. Okay, well, does the large negative impact on learning that they feel is going to be there, does it actually matter? And when pupils come back post-COVID, is that learning loss, whatever phrase they want to use, does it actually matter? And I can argue that yes, it does matter. It really does matter, is going to be my point. Take, for example, critical thinking. Now, Curriculum for Wales rightly highlights critical thinking. This is what we want for our pupils of the future. So we want to be critical, evaluative, analytical thinkers. This is what we want. And the guidance, Curriculum for Wales says, learners should be supported, ask meaningful questions, evaluate information, evidence and situations. This is good. This is what we want. Learners should become objective in their decision making. They should identify, develop arguments. And this is great, right? Critical thinking, evaluative thinking, analytical thinking is what we want. But I'd argue this, when we're looking at those things, critical thinking, analytical, evaluative, well, this quote from Dan Willingham, critical thinking is enabled by stores of extensive knowledge about the domain. Now, what does that mean? I think that means here, our ability to think is dependent on the quality and quantity of what we know. If we know a lot about a topic, then we're able to think about that in an evaluative and critical way. So the people who come up with the cure or the vaccine to COVID, their vast stores of knowledge, they use that knowledge, they combine knowledge, they put it together, and they came up with this creative solution of the vaccine. So our ability to think is dependent on what we know. So if we don't know a lot about something, if we've lost learning somewhere along the way, our ability to think is going to be sort of diminished. I'll give you an example now. This is a quote I like to use to sort of exemplify my point. I think I'll read it. I won't do the accent, but I will read it. And then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in 1 minute. And is there a way you can do something like that by injection inside? That was Trump, wasn't it? Trying to be analytical and perhaps creative and trying to solve a problem, but not having any knowledge and not being an expert in any way. And what his solution is thinking, his creative analytical thought is very, very unsophisticated because of this point here. Our ability to think is dependent on the quality and quantity of what we know. So this is my point really at the moment. The first part, what I'm saying is, if pupils have experienced a diminished educational diet, and that EEF research sort of backs that up, the negative impact on learning, I'd argue that pupils will come to us at some point when they come back to us, or even now, they're lacking certain knowledge and they're lacking a true understanding because of this diminished educational diet. And that lack of knowledge, that lack of understanding, I'd argue leads to less capacity for critical thought. And I think they're less capable for critical thought. So it matters. This learning loss really matters. The second point I want to make is about future learning. So we can say, right, they're going to come back. Well, let's just forget that. Let's just move on and teach them new stuff and go from there when they come back. Well, I'd argue there's an issue here. And this quote here, sort of, I'll start my point with this. The most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. We new things by connecting them to what we already know. So let me take I teach history, for example. So let's just say here, this little blue dot here represents perhaps the Treaty of Versailles. If pupils have a good grasp and understanding of the Treaty of Versailles, if they come to the next bit of our work, when we look at the problems of Weimar Germany, they'll really understand the problems of Weimar Germany better if they have a good understanding of the Treaty of Versailles. It unlocks that future understanding. And if they can understand those two things, when they come then to analyse or look at the rise of Hitler, for example, and fascism, it'll make more sense because they've got that wider contextual knowledge. So we learn new things by connecting them to what we already know. Things sort of make sense. The opposite being, the less we know, the less we have to connect that new learning to. So if pupils' learning has been diminished, they've had this diminished educational diet, and there's things they don't quite grasp and don't understand as much as we'd hope, I'd argue then when they come to learn new things, they're going to stumble because they're not going to be able to have the context. Things are going to sit in isolation and not in the context, and they won't be able to connect things as well. So for me, this diminished educational diet has an impact on critical thinking, but also on the negative impact on future learning. And I think if we don't address these issues, I think we're storing up problems for the future. It's not going to go away. And the two quotes from the EEF report, the large negative impact on learning, and this one, disadvantaged pupils suffer the most. And to me, this is a social justice issue, because as always, it'll be pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds who suffer the most. And through lockdown, that's sort of been seen, isn't it? Okay, in terms of technological differences and things along those lines. And I think we've got to do something about this because it's a social justice issue. It's what we could call the Matthew effect, where those who have will have more, basically, and those who are struggling will continue to struggle. And we need to do something about it. So here's my point. What should we do then? Because I'm arguing it does matter, and it really matters for those kids who really need it the most, the disadvantaged kids. So what should we do? Well, I say this, let's replenish the educational diet. When the kids are back, or even from now, let's just start, let's replenish the educational diet. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'd say in the short term, first of all, I think we need to revisit some essential concepts. Before we start moving on to future learning, let's revisit those essential concepts. As teachers think, what are those essential things they need to grasp here in order to help their future learning? So if they're going to move on to percentages, have they got their fractions understood? Do they know their fractions? If they do that, then they can have a better understanding of percentages. If we're going to do Weimar Germany, do they really know the Treaty of Versailles? Whatever it may be. I'm not saying we revisit everything, but the essential things, the things that are needed for future learning, I think we really need to sort of revisit before we move on. That would be my short term. And my longer term, I think we've got a huge, huge opportunity that we need to grasp here in Wales. And it's this, isn't it? It's the curriculum. We've got the opportunity now to design the curriculum with this in mind. And what I'd say is we need to give real consideration to what we want the pupils to learn, not necessarily how they're going to be learning, but what it is we want them to learn, what do we want them to understand, to know, to be able to do, because that is where the power is going to lie, I suppose. What do we want the pupils to learn? And I'll argue the curriculum, therefore, we need to design curriculum as school leaders and as teachers that is broad and it's valuable and it's coherent. And those are the three words I keep coming back to with this curriculum, and I really believe in this curriculum. And by broad, I mean we have a range of subjects, a breadth of subjects within there, a range of perspectives and voices, history and music and art and English literature and languages. Just keep the subjects, range of perspectives, range of voices for pupils. We need to make sure that curriculum is valuable. We're teaching real essential, important concepts, culturally valuable material for people to understand and get a sense of the world around them. Let's give them the stuff that's of real value, replenish the diet in that sense. And then obviously teach it with coherence. Okay, let's build it within subjects and across subjects. Let's sequence that learning so it supports the progression. Let's not teach things in isolation. What they learned last week will impact what they learn this week, and that will impact what they learn next week. We can transpose that to days, to weeks, to months, to years even. So that's about me done. Diolch yn fawr. If you do want to follow me on Twitter and harass me or ask me any questions, there's my Twitter there. So thank you very much. I think that's been done.
Diolch, James. Thanks very much. The sort of diminished educational diet is something that, we're all planning and looking into when we do get pupils back into schools for the new normal. Thanks for really highlighting that. Before I pass you on to Ben for closing remarks and summaries, just want to thank all the presenters for agreeing to talk today. We had a wide range of different opinions and different aspects. Again, just apologise for the slight technical issues. I think Matt mentioned about emergency solutions to issues. We had that today, where some of the workplace emails were kicking out and didn't like the Teams connection, so we put on the Zoom emergency solution, and that started to talk to each other after a while. But thank you to Tom Herbert, who has helped us immensely today. So thank you for that, for those emergency solutions. I'll pass you over to Ben. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. What an interesting and engaging evening it's been. We started with Mick's call for some blue sky thinking and for a curriculum that touches the hearts of our students. We talked about pedagogy and technological solutions being the plumbing for students' learning, and the devices that they access that through being the taps. A very nice analogy from Abdul. We went on then to talk about the accountability culture that exists in education at the moment, and how this may affect the well-being of our students, and that fear of failure that we know many of them have, that GCSEs are seen as an endpoint, an outcome rather than part of the process. We talked then about the need potentially for friendly agitators, those people who will build that brave and bold snowball and start it rolling down the hill before that snow melts away and we lose the opportunity to do something moving forwards. We talked, or Neil talked about the potentially seismic shift that we could see from a teacher-centered pedagogy to a student-centered pedagogy, and that linked really nicely with thoughts about agency and choice. And Jordan's research project that went on to show that actually when you give students choice about their learning, we see dramatic improvements in their engagement, especially in the virtual world. We went on to talk about potential gaps in learning, and there was a comment regarding Donald Trump and his comments around intravenous disinfectant use, and how that lack of critical thinking in that moment was potentially based upon a distinct lack of understanding in that case. And then, so how do we go about remedying that diminished educational diet that our students have had in the short term? Do we think about revising and amending our curricula to deal with that? And also then long term, how can we go about embracing and making the most of the future curriculum reform that we are going through in Wales? So as I said, an incredibly interesting and engaging evening. It's been, I hope, thought-provoking. I hope it has challenged your thinking. What's been pleasing, I think, is that overriding sense that COVID presents a wonderful opportunity. There's been real hope and optimism, and it's a really pleasant counter perspective to something that is often presented in a relatively negative way. So perhaps as we move forward, we should bear in mind that if we do as we've always done, we will get what we've always got. And maybe whilst technology is important, we have to acknowledge that even this evening, it's not always been quite there. There is still a need, certainly in terms of well-being, for us to remember that human touch is important and that face-to-face will always have a place in the job that we do. So to finish, a massive thank you to all of the speakers this evening. A huge thank you to all of you for joining us and for listening in. A big thank you and a well done to Jamie for organising this event, and as Jamie's mentioned already, a big thank you to those who are sat behind screens who have helped it all to happen this evening. So to finish, thank you all, take care of yourselves, and thank you for joining us. Take care from Chepstow.